Welcome to the Learning Reinvented Podcast, brought to you by myself, James Poletyllo, and the team at The Learning Effect. There are lots of learning podcasts out there, so we wanted to do something slightly different. This week, we're exploring the role of storytelling and language in learning. I'm delighted to welcome Andreas Loizou to the podcast. Thank you for joining us, Andreas. Do you want to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell them a little bit about your background?
I don't really, because I've really got a problem with a lot of introductions because they're really slow and ponderous. So I have two techniques, one of which is kind of let it drip out over the course of the conversation, or I do something really, really quickly. And what I do reflects one of my big ideas, which is, well, when I say my idea, it's actually Aristotle's idea. And it's based on how we choose the people we listen to. And he split this into three categories, which should come down to us as ethos, pathos, and logos. And I think I would prefer to start with that rather than do like a 3-hour autobiography for your listeners. So let's start with Aristotle and his first category, which is ethos. This is about the essential character of a person. It's your personal credibility. So our personal credibility as a speaker or as a writer comes from our expertise, what we've done, our status. Maybe we're going to choose to listen to people who are higher status within a firm or within the world, and also from their learning. We are very much influenced by people who have degrees from high quality institutions, or who have degrees just generally, or who have a high academic standing. So we actually split here between the academic side and the real life side. And this is kind of why people believe in us. A great example here. I think all around the world, everybody trusts David Attenborough. We know that he's read the books. We know that he's been on the treks. So when we see him, we instinctively think, right, this is someone who I can trust. This is someone who I'm going to listen to. So that's our first characteristic, or our first factor, which is ethos, which is basically about someone's character. The second factor is pathos, which is about emotion. Pathos is where we get words like empathy. So we will instinctively choose people who can talk about their life experiences. And this is where we use phrases like war stories. And this is a really good time. If you're speaking to anyone, it's a really good time to talk about the things that went really badly in your life, or when you really screwed up. People love it, instinctively love it, when someone says, you know what, I was really confident and then this happened and it all fell to pieces. We always feel attracted towards people who are honest, who have failed and then overcome that failure. So this is where you get a very strong emotional bond with a reader or a speaker. And the last thing we look at is logos, which is your skill in organizing, or your skill in telling your story. And this, where pathos was about emotions, this is about rationality. This is where you're using the evidence that you've come across, or the facts that back up your story, or when you talk about how this happened in the past and how the past is the same, or how the past has changed now and is no longer as relevant. This is about presenting and organizing your story. So let's have a look at some of these, how these contrast. Let's look at the difference between pathos and logos. If someone is making a really passionate emotional speech, we're attracted to that initially. But if it's 20 or 30 minutes of emotions, we think, hold on, we believe in your power of storytelling. We believe in your passion for this. But come on, we need something more than that. We need a narrative. We need you to lead us from where we are now into the future. But if someone is just logical, it's just someone who's really well organized, we love that because we feel that we're going to move from where we are now to somewhere in the future. But we're not going to enjoy the story. We need someone to explain to us how they felt why they were taking part in this journey that they're talking about. So actually, to be a good speaker, you're going to need all three of these things. So ethos, pathos, and logos for me. So my ethos, it comes really from two sides. I studied English, so I've got 2 degrees in English, and that's really important. That's reading and writing, really important part of my life. But I also worked in finance, so I qualified as a chartered accountant, and I worked in investment banking. So my ethos, my experience, comes from 2 very different sides. It comes from business and it comes from story. So for me, I feel really confident putting these 2 different sides together and talking about business storytelling. I've also worked for 20 years in training. That's been my main job. So if I throw that into the mix, I think I've got 3 legs, if you like, that are high in ethos. My writing and storytelling skills, my financial skills, and my training skills. Now, in terms of pathos, how can I connect with you? Well, I'm always someone that kind of very much learns from mistakes. And I talk, when I'm training, I talk about I did this and it went wrong because I hadn't done this. So for me, when I train, there's no point just being logos about saying, this is slide 7, this is slide 8, and this is 9B. That doesn't work. It doesn't work for the audience, doesn't work for me. I like to connect with people. I think when you're training, people will tell you this, if they work in L&D, there are those great moments when a single person or sometimes a whole room gets it. And for me, that's a really marvelous time. The other thing that's where I feel that I'm high in pathos is that I set up a charity called the Margate Bookie to encourage the love of reading and writing in my hometown. Margate's a town you'll often hear about now as a town that's being regenerated. I grew up there and it was a pretty grim place. So I've kind of dedicated, I think it's been running for 7 or 8 years, not my whole time, but a certain amount of time to that. And I've learned tremendously from that. And I really, it's really been a great introduction to many different types of people that I've really liked connecting with. Now, in terms of logos, I've got my book. This is not just a plug for a book. This is actually to tell you what a book does. When you write a book, when you spend a lot of time writing and refining a book, my book is published by Quercus, so it's not kind of a self-published book. It's something that's been edited and legally checked and then revised and proofread. What you end up with, which is something that's really tight. So it's not a massively long book. It's 40,000 words. But it took a year to write and it took a year to revise. So there's nothing spare about that book. There's no like kind of surplus fat lying around. It's very, very tightly organized. So when you read it, or when you open the contents page, you get a very strong sense that someone has spent a long time thinking about how to present this material. And this is typical of how I work. I will spend a lot of time planning. When the temptation is to start writing, I think a general lesson for anybody doing storytelling here is just stop, rein it in, plan it. When you're really desperate to write, it's sometimes because you don't want to plan it, you don't want to think about it, you just want that kind of exam feeling of getting the first page done. That's not a great way. That's not the best way to write a book. It's far better to plan and to kind of really organize your thoughts. And that's going to help you create a narrative. So I feel very much with the book, it's very high in logos. It's very tightly organized. And what happens when things are tightly organized, you don't notice they're organized. The reader should just feel, oh, actually, yeah, this flows. This makes sense. So that's a really long introduction to me, not talking about doing an introduction.
I think you've covered so much in that introduction. I'm just trying to work out where I go next. But just to pick up on one of those last points you made, and that importance of almost not rushing to put something down and not rushing to get the words down on the page, whether you're writing a book or putting together a training course or whatever else you're composing or compiling in your role. And I think that's a really interesting point, because I find myself doing that sometimes. I find myself when I'm working on a project, or when I'm putting together a new program, or working on how we're going to help a client change how they do their learning. You might spend a day where you do nothing, and you physically produce nothing, but you're there thinking about stuff, you're planning. And I remember back when I was in the corporate world, there's almost that drive to not have that reflection time, to not have the time to be able to plan. There's often the rush to action to produce something, and sometimes that's maybe why the results aren't, as you said, that I was thinking, I can see where things have gone wrong, because the drive has been to action rather than initial contemplation, planning, a bit of pre-reflection. We do reflection at the end generally. We don't tend to do it when we're faced with a new challenge. We tend to, lots of people rush to try and produce something, to get something down, to get an answer in. And that taking that time to reflect, I think, is a really good lesson. But I know how the world sometimes pushes you in a different direction.
Well, the world and ourselves, when you use a phrase like to get an answer in, I think this feeling goes all the way back to exams. And I always remember a guy at my school who would write really quickly any exam he was in, and he loved to be the person that kind of was the first person in the exam hall to turn over the page, to get onto page 2. Now, he never did brilliantly. He was a good student, never did brilliantly in exams, because he didn't sort of stop and look at the question. And I think the urge to, as you say, to physically produce something is so strong that it stops us. And what happens is it stops us thinking about the audience. So when I'm storytelling, or actually when I'm doing any sort of client work, I am consistently focused on the audience, because I know if I've got a group of people for an hour or for 2 days, I sometimes do online courses to maybe 200 people. That's a lot of time to waste. 200 people times 2 days times 7 hours per day. That's a lot that could potentially just be, just go down the drain. So this idea of actually, you stop, you don't produce anything physical, but you actually go through and think, well, what do they want from me? And to be very reductive, I split this into 3 areas, and this applies to storytelling, to writing, to an article, whatever. It's like there are 3 really, really basic areas that you need to consider. So the first thing is what I call useful, and that's something that is needed right now. So, for example, if there's a blockage in my sink now, as I'm talking to you, James, I don't care about the design. I don't care about the company's message. I want a plumber. I want her name. I want her number. Nothing else matters to me. So I need to think, is there an immediate need for something useful now? Then I think about the later. I think about what I call this interesting. What can I file away, or what can my audience file away for the future? They're not going to react to this now. They're not going to call the plumber, but maybe one of the things that I'm talking about, or one of the lessons I'm trying to impart, will be relevant to them in a week's time, or in 6 months' time when they need to do a presentation, they want something with impact. They'll remember what we spoke about. And the last element here is enjoyable. Now, this is especially important if your content is very technical and there's resistance in the room from what you're trying to teach them. So I remember being involved in training at the financial regulator, where it's a fairly complicated financial course, but there was resistance because there was an exam at the end of 3 days. So of course that changed everything. That changed the whole spirit of the course. Everybody was nervous. As soon as you go into the room, you can see people are tense. You can see it in their body language. So you have a duty of care to the people in your room to think, actually, they're actually going through a certain amount of stress and you haven't even opened your mouth yet. So what can you do to make it enjoyable? And this is not about, doing songs or musical numbers. This is about having content that's, cleverly presented, that they're going to remember without trouble. For example, if they're going to have an exam, then you've got to make sure that you revise the points that are going to come up for them. so that they can feel by the end, what I aim for on a 3-day course is that by the end of day 2, even though we haven't covered all the material, they will be fairly confident that if they did their homework on the evening of day 2, they were likely to pass. So the enjoyable aspect comes with things like, especially if you're talking about something complex like financial analysis, using analogies, creating pictures in a listener's mind, avoiding waffly business language and putting your training into language that connects, that has high empathy. And you can see this like in L&D, you can see this from outlines. If you go on courses, I'm not talking about tailored courses here. I'm talking about sort of generic courses where companies will send one person or maybe 2 people to a course, and you can read the outline. And if you read something like, who is this course for? Major objectives. And if the major objectives aren't clear, if their bullet points are 3 words long, whoever's written that is not thinking about the reader, because your bullet point needs to be 3, maybe 4 words long. And you want, as an absolute maximum, you want 5 bullet points, maybe 3 is a better target. When you see something that's got 12 bullet points, you're not thinking about the reader. So for me, it's all about, before you write a word, you've got to start with your audience. You've got to completely understand what they want. And that leads to that slightly uncomfortable feeling you spoke about, which is, I want to produce something. I want to produce something physical, but I know I have to think about it. Now, the way around this, because, let's accept this emotion that we feel like we're procrastinating, which is never comfortable. What I do is I kind of sketch out things in a notebook with pencil. I do mind maps on paper, and then I transfer my mind maps or whatever kind of organizational method you have to a computer version. Important thing to think about here is your planning is just your planning. If something changes kind of on the next day, then you change your plan. But this is a great way to actually get your ideas flowing, get yourself thinking about the audience, but also get rid of that feeling of, I'm not producing anything. If you can get to the end of a day like this, say, I'm preparing a lengthy financial course for a university this winter. It's 3 or 4 days of like really lengthy mind maps, but never, unlike you, I have no fear in telling myself, actually, I am producing something. It's just that no one else can really understand it. It's a mind map for me. But and I know as well, from what I know about you, that the work you're doing on that day is not wasted. It's going to reflect in a higher quality course later on. So, a sort of really general point here about writing and storytelling is sometimes these feelings of being uncomfortable, they're just part of the process. And once you've done it a few times, you get to this point, you think, here's the bit where I feel a bit shit about not banging out some slides. No one else feels that, especially your audience. No one else is thinking, God, James is really late with his slides for the course. It's in 2 months' time.
No, absolutely. And I think there's, people work their way through those different processes for themselves. And you started off by talking about ethos, pathos, and logos, and that going all the way back to Aristotle. And that's obviously, a process that you build in, probably subconsciously as well as consciously into how you approach things. And when people are choosing their speakers or refining their speaking style, how can they, use those things themselves? How can that become a practical tool for people to think about either their own resonance with an audience or, who within their company, or if they're selecting external speakers or anything else? How can they turn that into a practical approach?
Well, I talk about a practical approach for someone who's presenting themselves, rather than someone that's bringing in an external speaker. I work with a certain amount of speakers and writers, and kind of in a mentor relationship. One of the things I do with them is say, like, who would you like to be as a speaker? And what I don't ask them is like what person you'd like to be. I ask them what characteristics you'd like to portray, and sort of some of the words. if they get stuck, I've got a list of 50 words, but some of the words that tend to come up are they want to be authoritative, smart, emotional, intellectual, gentle, inspiring, powerful, witty, organized, sincere, philosophical, and impartial. So these words, some of these words are definitely in conflict. So they look at this list and they come up, and I encourage them to come up with different words. And I say, look, what are the 5 most important words? And then people come up with kind of a list of really kind of what's most important to them. So for me, and I expanded this a little bit. I like people who are intelligent but not pompous. So I like people who can use humor to explain things. I like people who've done their homework. So I detest people bluffing. I hate people that make it up on the spot. You can improvise, but you can only improvise from a really strong base. It takes me 3 seconds to notice if someone is bluffing. I like people talking about their real experiences. And I'm kind of more attracted to people who are, let me be clear, we often put this distinction between analytical and emotional. I like people who are analytical about their emotions. So I like people who can look back and say, I felt great because of this, or I felt terrible because of this. And then I ask the people, right, you've got this list of 5. How would this be reflected in how you present? So people say, actually, you know what, I want to show these characteristics. And then we start to think, who's that like? Who is kind of driven and honest? Who is erudite and knowledgeable? And basically, I don't believe in this idea of copying a person. I don't think that is a good thing to do. But I do think we are the sum of our influences. So I tend to come up with a list of maybe 4 or 5 writers or presenters or influencers that they like. We tend to choose the people we like, obviously, because we're not going to model ourselves or copy the characteristics of people we detest. So what you produce eventually is a kind of refined version of your own character. And I think you need to have that, or you need to be aware of that before you start presenting. Again, this is not something that takes 20 minutes. This is not a lifetime of therapy. This is a really quick list of things you can go through. And again, it's a planning stage. It's part of the planning stage. So if you can think about this, actually, that person or these people would really work with these sorts of people. And as long as you've got to make it kind of congruent to you, you've got to make it that it actually fits you. But I think of it as kind of like you with the colours slightly turned up, with the volume slightly turned up. And I think that gets us into a zone. And having that awareness of ourselves also hugely increases our awareness of the audience. And when we write, we start to think about, what are we trying to do with our writing? What are our objectives? And that's really important.
And I think that, you're talking about the importance of the audience. You've got the person delivering there, and it's why you'll listen to them. And I know back through my career, I've met lots of people who find the thought of telling their story or speaking in front of others or being able to put together what they do into a structure that's understood by others to be really difficult. And I think that's becoming more and more important in learning now, because so much of the world is disparate, and we used to have the time for someone who was a subject matter expert to be approached by a learning person to help them to start to put together their story, to then take that to push it out over a period of time. You talked about the length of time it takes to put together a book. The time to turn around, or that requirement to share your own subject matter expertise. And you might not be the best speaker in the world or the most expert, but I think being able to spread that ability to have confidence and some level of structure to help someone who has some knowledge and wants to convey that to someone else, because we don't have that luxury, the time or the resource to always be able to do that. And more organizations are relying on a wider set of people to share their experiences, so I think creating that ability and some framework is really helpful or would be really helpful in an organization, because too many people are scared or can't unpick or can't structure their own knowledge into a way that someone else could decipher it, because it's their own knowledge and it's this mish and mash up in their head and they don't know how to get it out.
Yeah, I agree that, but I think what you say kind of creates, in my mind, an image of someone who's never spoken in public before, and suddenly like there's 4,000 people in front of them and the microphone's not going to work, and oh no, the slides don't work and I've dropped my notes and stuff like that. Storytelling begins with us just talking to one person, and the story is kind of really simple. And when I'm going to tell you something, you'll notice this in every company you work with from now on. There are people that will just grab you in the corner and you'll be talking over a canteen or in the pub or whatever, and you say, yeah, no, this happened to me. Or this guy who's so good at this, what he used to do was X, Y, Z. Or there was this time when, and actually what we've done is we've made storytelling such a kind of nervy event, when actually it's one of the kind of like the most human interactions in the world. So I think you should, instead of thinking of yourself like kind of like getting on stage at Wembley Stadium, just imagine talking to someone, to a friend, in the corridor, and you'll pass people today or tomorrow that'll be telling stories like this, where it's kind of called a dramatic gap story. And they're talking about themselves, and it starts with the before. It was like, yesterday I couldn't do this. And there's the dramatic gap. Something happened that turned them from the person that couldn't do this to the after person, which is, I can do this now. And an example here is people that have failed their driving tests 1,000 times, or let's stick with the driving test example. So I was really, really, really nervous before because I'd failed 999 times. What was the dramatic gap? What was different about that time? Well, I went to the hypnotherapist, or I just felt really great that morning. Or I realised actually I had to pass because tomorrow I was going to take everybody on a trip. That's perhaps a slightly dangerous example. And then you move into, you pass, and then you talk about how you feel afterwards. And the obstacle, whatever the obstacle was, in this case, passing the driving test, it could be passing the exam, it could be selling to a client, it could be launching to a new product, is actually not the point of this. The idea is, how did you feel before, and how will you change, and how did you feel afterwards? And these are stories that we tell to each other, actually to ourselves, all the time. And if we think more on the story, that what happened, the impact it had on us, then actually, you know what, when we talk to 3 people or 5 people or a group of 20 or 100 people online, what we're portraying is not, hey, I conquered this obstacle. What we're actually talking about is how I as a human felt before and how I felt afterwards. And that's kind of really, really powerful. And then you realize when you do stories like that, especially when it's kind of personal, you know what? The audience is always on your side. Okay, so I think generally in presentations, we do a lot of presentation skills training. People think, oh, I'm being judged, they're really negative. It's not. So that's not the case. Always remember, the vast majority of the audience, they're not your enemies. They want you to succeed, because we all hate it when a presentation, is too long or it's stuffy or it's boring. They want you to talk as human beings. Yeah, they want you to make a positive impact on them, and also to have a positive experience for yourself. So often when you read the books about how to conquer your nerves, kind of doing presentations, writers don't mention this. But actually, pretty much everyone wants you to succeed. It seems such a basic thing to put out there, but that's what you want. It's like, if you're online and the tech goes bad and the speaker disappears, you don't think, oh God, what an idiot, he can't get his internet to work. You think, oh, poor guy, I've been in that situation. He's going to have to turn everything off and switch on, and it's only going to be 90 seconds. It's going to be the worst 90 seconds of his life. So we have a lot of empathy towards speakers, and you can build up that empathy as well. You can increase that, and that's going to get the audience on your side.
No, I think that's, a couple of really important points in there, that, as you said, that dramatic overcoming obstacles, that, as you said, people will do that in the corner, in the canteen, in the pub, outside the playground, wherever it happens to be. That natural rhythm of storytelling is part of human history. That's how we've passed on information forever, is through storytelling. And it's that, as you said, that fear, the rabbit in the headlights type thing of as soon as you've got to do that, even if that is just put down in paper, or write an article, write a blog, write about what you do in your job, come and talk to someone, come on a podcast. The amount of people who freeze when they go, I'd love to do it, but I don't have the confidence to talk about myself, I don't have anything interesting to say. And I think all of those fear things get in the way of people just performing as they naturally would, if all the pressure was off and they were in a more comfortable place. They forget they probably have those natural transferable skills, as you said, because it's very, very human to be able to tell that story.
Yes, definitely. We put pressure on ourselves. I'm not saying don't be prepared, don't practice, don't be blasé about speaking to a huge audience or any audience, but it's a really natural thing. And if people think there's nothing interesting about them, just I turn around. When I meet people, I always think, how do they get to this place in time? Who are they? Where are they? Like you say with you, what's he doing this for? How comes? We've spoken before. We have so many things in common that we're not going to talk about on this podcast. But there's so many points of connections, and pretty much all humans are going to have that. And just on a really practical thing, if you're stuck with a blog post or something like that, it's just a horrible feeling when you know what you want to say and you can't get it out. It's just use a voice recorder, have a cup of tea. If there's no one around, just imagine you're talking to someone. I call this Claire in the chair. There's someone I always think about when I can't visualize my audience. I just think of this one person who's not a subject matter expert. She's got very high standards, but she's supportive. But I know she's got a very expressive face. If I'm talking rubbish, or if I'm bluffing, or if I'm just like not making sense, I can see it straight in her. I can imagine that in her. So all I do now, I visualize her, take the voice recorder, and you know what? I talk to her, and I get the blog. I don't write a lot of blog pieces, but if I'm doing an article, say, I can get the gist of an article in 15 minutes, and I can get it voice recorded, or increasingly now, I speak straight into words. And speaking is really important. The speaking is really important because the words you're going to use, I'm not going to say at this moment in time, I'm going to say now, because I'm speaking like a human. I'm not going to say in the event that, I'm going to say if, because I'm speaking like a person and I'm speaking into the mic. And that's a really good thing. If you get that sort of, I hesitate to use the phrase writer's block, because I don't think it really exists. It's just like, it's like in any task that we do, sometimes it doesn't flow. I never heard, when I was at PwC, I never heard anybody say, I've got accountant's block. They would just say, I'm a bit stuck on this. In those days, they probably go out, have a cigarette and a pint or something, and come back, and the block would go. So there are lots of, I talk about a little bit of this in the story, though. There are lots of ways to get through these feelings of being stuck. But the most important thing is to kind of admit to yourself that actually being stuck is a normal part of any process. It's like you just need to go through that.
No, and I think there's that performance anxiety, that whatever it happens to be that gets in the way, like you said, I do the same. I will quite often talk straight into Word, or I will record myself, do a phone record capture if there's something that I want to write, because my brain moves quicker than my fingers do as well, and I kind of lost the essence of something if I've had a good idea or if I want to get something down. So I think we all have our little techniques that we use to capture things. Now, you've also touched upon the interest of everyone's got a story and everyone's got a journey, and we all come from somewhere different. And one of the reasons I do this is I love to find out people's stories. And, you know, we've had a conversation before about lots of different things, but you touched on earlier that you've almost got this quite interesting three-legged chair or stool that that is your background and your professional experience. And again, lots of people will have those different things, and it's like the old, you know, joke about the accountant with the personality, or whatever it happens to be, the finance person who with the writing skills. You know, you've got a set of skills that people wouldn't necessarily put together. So, you know, how does that come together for you? How do you manage all those things? I'd just love to know a bit more about, you know, how that plays out and what you see amongst your peers and everything else.
Well, I've always had these, certainly, by the time I was 18, sort of a really crucial time for me was A-levels. I had to choose between English literature and economics. And also I was working, that summer before going to university, I was teaching English as a foreign language to students who came to Margate. And I think my three interests were already established there. I think one thing I learned, but I didn't learn this until 25 years later, is that the things that we're naturally good at, the things that we're naturally interested in, we don't value highly enough. So for me, my ability to start conversations with people, or my interest in how marketing a business works, or my desire to explain things to people that they don't understand, these were just completely natural callings. And I never valued them. And it was only until it's kind of interesting. It only started when I started the charity. I started Margate Bookie in, I don't know, what was it? It's been going a long time now, so 2015, something like that. And I met people, and I met someone that says, "Oh God, you know, I do that, but I hate meeting new people." And that was the first time I realised that not everybody wants to meet new people. And that was a real shock to me, because what I took as an absolute given for me didn't extend to other people. Now, this guy had so many other skills and natural abilities, but he didn't have that. And I just thought, and I was talking to him. He said, you know, I get really nervous. I think people are judging me, how I look, what I say. I feel like I talk too much and I don't talk enough. I said, God, you're going through so much pressure. And I can just sit next to someone and start chatting to them. And I thought that was a real moment of revelation to me, because I kind of work-wise often chose things that were quite difficult for me. And it took me 30 years of working, no, not 30 years, but maybe 20 years of work to think, oh God, you know, what do you really like doing? And I remember when I left banking, I was quite bored with that. And I was searching around for something to do. You know, I went to, I had 4 sessions with a workplace psychologist, and it was the first time I consciously thought about what I want from work. And you know what? We made a list of what was important to me, and money was 8th or 9th. I'd always believed it was about the cash. And it wasn't for me at all. And that was like really shocking. And she was basically saying that, you know, in retrospect, it's a really easy question. She said, out of all the things you've done, what did you most enjoy doing? I said, I loved that summer when I taught English. Oh, that was great. And she said, have you thought about teaching? I thought, no, it's too simple, or, it's too easy for me. She said, look, yeah, just once in your life, just why don't you take a slightly easier option? And then when I started training, I started doing financial training, you know, one surprise was that the money was really good. So it wasn't like I was working at poverty wages. But the second thing is, like, from the very first, almost from the interview where I did the presentation, I thought, God, I really like this. I love this, I've missed this. And for me, it was that realization that you could actually use the things that come easy to you. I've never said come naturally, because I don't think things do come naturally, but there are propensities, there are certain things that are easy for us. Some people, some of your listeners will be working in HR, working in ND, but they'll be really great visual artists, and they'll think they're probably not told their colleagues, because it just doesn't seem to fit in work. Whereas I became happier, so like when I was doing courses in hard financial maths, to talk about books, and especially about movies, where movies about finance. I started to introduce those into, talk about why does this happen in Wall Street, why does Eddie Murphy buy all the oranges in trading places and then sell them really quickly. And I just thought it was a really good way to make contact with people. I just think we've got things that are that are easier for us. They're not quite gifts, but they're attitudes, or a sense that this really suits me. I thought, well, actually, why don't I go that way? And I was able to sort of say there were three legs that I kind of really enjoy. How do I bring them together? And they came together. It was very, this wasn't an accident. I sat down and I thought, right, how do I get into my 40s? What do I do in my 50s that's going to keep me happy, that's going to keep me smart, and it's going to keep me learning? I was never going to be that guy on the bus with a Sudoku book. I was always going to be the guy kind of reading something that was going to push one of these areas forward. And it makes me think, actually, it makes me look forward to the future and what's the positivity. Because I do see people, there's someone I work with who I would say is probably mid-70s, and he's absolutely great. And he really shows this idea of always learning. And I think that's we're lucky, or everybody listening to this, you're in a really, really good environment.
I think there's so many opportunities now, and to learn new things. There's so many almost hybrid roles or hybrid professions that you don't have to stay in the same traditional swim lane that you might have been in the past. And like you said, there might be someone in HR who's great at visual arts, or someone else who's great at this. And I think you traditionally would look back and go, right, an accountant does this, a lawyer does this, an HR person does this, an engineer does this. But people are the sum of so many different skills, strengths, things that come easy to them, or things they're just interested in, and being able to look at where you fit and evolve your career and find a space where you're learning, you're passionate, you're able to fulfill yourself and others in the way that adds value to you is where I hope that learning and careers are going in the future, because I think we have started to break down those professional silos, and there are opportunities to tap into the talents of everyone in your business, because we sometimes in the past have put aside that visual artist bit or the writing bit because you're in finance or whatever it happens to be, because that wasn't what's valued. But if you can find the space where those mix, I think it's a great place to be. And that's been part of my journey, and it's that thing of reflecting back and thinking, what am I good at? What do I like? Where did I find my energy? Where did I enjoy? What I never had a plan, but I always seem to gravitate towards similar situations. So whatever it happens to be, I think the evidence is there for you. And whether you need that conversation with someone else or a bit of reflection time, I think people are on really interesting journeys, and the possibilities are what excite me for where careers and work and creativity and all sorts of things can go in the future.
Yes, definitely. I think especially when I started working, there was very much an idea that you took a job and that was your profession, and you would do that until 65. And that just seemed an incredibly depressing way to live a life. It just seemed like really sad. So what I've tended to do is work at places or work in roles for about 3 jobs. So I was never the best at anything. but I think most jobs, apart from say like surgery, you can, or the highest reaches of science, you can get a pretty good feel for a job in 3 years and have enough for it to be knowledge that you can use. I think I wonder if this is decreasing, but I think in sort of the 90s and the thousands, noughties, there's a tremendous flexibility in the UK, and I would meet people who'd, I've got a friend who set up a vet and then became a publisher. I've got a friend who was a professional ballet dancer who loved her move into computer sales. I just think we've all got all these different things, and I love it when you meet. I actually love it when you meet people, and there's like that secret bit that doesn't really fit with them.
Absolutely.
The most extreme example of this was my father had a stroke, and I was talking to his speech therapist. I spent a lot of time with her, and she this is so bizarre. She told me she was a trained bullfighter. And I was like, oh, come on. Yeah, of course you are. Of course. She came in the next day with an album of her in Sevilla. She wasn't Spanish. She wasn't English. I'm not going to give her nationality, because if you live in East Kent, you might have come across her. And she had this photo album of her, with literally quite small balls, not killing them, but like practicing the passes and stuff like that. And I just thought, this is, if you put that in a novel, speech therapist and bullfighter, female matadora, female bullfighter, no one's going to believe that. You couldn't even get that on Amazon Prime, something that ludicrous. And it was true. And I was just like fascinated that someone could live their lives like that. And I always thought, how could you mold those two careers together? But she never did, and she kept completely silent about that side of her life. And I just wonder if there's people listening to this, they've got a bit. They've got that. We all have our hidden worlds, but maybe there's something that actually you're dying to show your colleagues, and that you've never had the guts. I do fear, though, unfortunately, with the way, especially in the UK, the way things are going, I wonder if mobility is decreasing. I feel really desperately sorry for people in their 20s and early 30s who kind of lack the opportunities that maybe I had to change jobs, and also social mobility. When I went to university, not only did I get a grant to live off, I got my fees paid. And that meant people like me, who were grammar school kids, who grew up in poor towns, could go and study and, change the trajectory of their lives. I see less of that now. That's a real sadness for me. And I think my generation has done a terrible disservice to younger people. I think we've made, for a lot of people, made the way they can live their life is going to be less enjoyable than we did. And I feel kind of like, when I look at the real baby boomers, they've, who've got pensions, their pensions are much higher than most people's earnings, And I think that's how, that's not to say they should cut their pensions. I think that should be the same for every person in the world. I just think, I feel sorry for the UK. Of course, Brexit is a part of this, things like the Erasmus scheme, that it's now impossible. It's kind of impossible, unless you've got family financing, to go abroad and have a different experience and learn the beginnings of a new language or perfect what you already have. I think that's going, and I think that's tremendously sad.
No, I think there's a lot of challenges facing, us as a society, as an economy, and we need to look at the values that we drive through that. So, I recognise, a lot of what you're saying, and we may not be able to go back to what we had, but how do we create those opportunities in different ways, and how do we reshape to bring that value and that, like you said, mobility, even things like working from home, actually in some ways reduces career trajectory, mobility, and the ability to meet people from outside your circle. So there's lots of things that are happening in society that will have consequences we're maybe not foreseeing now, and will have knock-on consequences. But flipping forward to the positive, so given your eclectic three-legged stool that's there in the background, what comes next for you, Andreas?
What comes next? Oh, well, I've got another book which I'm planning with the publisher. And what I've done during I guess the sort of the backstory to the story is everything is that I wrote this during confinement. So the contract came kind of probably 2 weeks after COVID started. And I was saying to my daughter, I always remember us having this conversation, saying, look, and then I think we're probably going to have to stay in for like 2 or 3 weeks now. This is going to be quite serious. And then kind of like 9 months later, we crawled out of the bunker. But it was absolutely brilliant timing for me. And what it did, it gave me a different routine, because while she was doing school online, we only had one laptop. So she was taking that. So I would spend minimum time on the computer. So I wrote a lot of this book longhand. I did all the planning, and I use these really big kind of sketchbooks that you get from Tiger for like £2.50 or something like that. They're not lined or anything. You can just write your thoughts down, and if it's rubbish, you just tear the page out. So I did all the planning on paper. I did a lot of the writing on paper or with phones and stuff like that. And then in the evening, I would write it up. And that gave me, because I already taught most of the book. I already had a voice established, so I was able, by using the recorders and then typing up. The book is, everyone says the book just sounds like you. It's exactly the same voice, which I think is a really good thing. But what I really got from that is this idea that you'll see this all over the internet. People are always selling you products like writing schools, but this actually does work, which is you just do an hour a day. You get up, maybe you're working, say you're listening to this and you're working, if you can, especially if you're working the days you're working at home, get up a bit earlier, get up an hour earlier, don't wash, maybe make a cup of tea, then just get writing as early as you can before your judgmental brain comes in and criticizes you and edits you, and just write any old rubbish at first. Just keep going. Don't set yourself a word count limit, set yourself a time limit. Say, I will write for 40 minutes, I will write for an hour. No, certainly no more than an hour. You know what happens after a couple of weeks? An idea for a book, be it fiction or non-fiction, will start to flower up, and one of the things you're working on will become a concept. And if you can't write anything, just write down, why can't I write anything? Because, and before you know it, you've done the 40 minutes, you've done the hour. So the second book, I've done the first draft, and I did that kind of hour by hour. That won't appear in the shops for another 2 or 3 years. Such is the world of publishing. That's absolutely fine. That's what you go to accept. But you've got to have that. Got to have that first version. And actually, if you're good to yourself, if you say, look, I don't mind what I'm writing, I'm just writing, your first version will come, and it will come much quicker than you can ever imagine. And that's why writing is just like tiling, or it's just like window cleaning, or it's just like accounting, is that you have to sit at a desk, you have to clock in, and you have to do it. You're not wandering lonely as a cloud. It's great that you've got inspiration, but everybody's got inspiration. Everybody believes they can write a book, and so few people take the first steps. And I think there's fear in there as well. But I would encourage everybody listening to this, just tomorrow morning, see if you can write 20 minutes. I bet you can. I really bet you can.
Some really great advice there, Andreas, and lots of useful practical tips throughout the podcast episode as well. So if anyone wants to connect with you and, follow your thoughts, get involved with the Margate Bookie or whatever else, you're involved in, how's the best way of them doing that?
Well, this is quite an interesting question, because I've been thinking a lot about this, and I've been thinking about it. So quick answer is LinkedIn, right? Quick answer is LinkedIn. Just send me a message, say hello. I accept everyone. The longer answer is kind of I've become a little bit obsessed with the idea of writers online who have huge amounts of profile but don't write books. So you go to LinkedIn or Twitter. You can follow Margate Bookie on Twitter, which I don't do. I've got people, I've my team who are great. They do the tweets and stuff like that. But there are lots of people who I think are spending 95% of their time on social media and 4% of their time making tea and 1% of their time writing, if they're lucky. So I'm kind of thinking, oh, maybe I should do online courses. Maybe I should do this. Maybe I should do that. Maybe I should have handouts or whatever. And then there's quite a bit of me that says, no, come on, write the book. The book's the thing. You know, you can be nice and polite online, but, you know, do you want to be one of those guys shouting on YouTube, follow me, follow me? I probably don't think that's me. Probably don't. I love presenting. I love teaching people, but I really have a problem with the kind of online author thing. And I know some people will be listening. Some in their minds, and some people's minds are like, oh no, I really want to do that, interact with my readers, and, you know, go to launches and stuff like that. I just say, write the book first, and then you can do it.
So it's a really long conversation.
Yeah,
you can have the conversation about what you've written rather than just the conversation. Fabulous.
Because that phrase, I feel like I've got a book inside me. You probably haven't, unless you actually sit down and write it. So.
Thank you very much for joining us today. It's been lovely talking to you.
A pleasure, James. A pleasure. Great to speak to you again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Learning Reinvented podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you've not already done so, please follow our podcast. And if the Learning Effect can help you and your organisation, please do get in touch. You can find both James and Katie on LinkedIn, and our contact details are in the show notes below.